If you have a Bible with you, could you turn with me, please? I'm going to take this off already. I'm warm. Can we turn to Joshua chapter 8? And this is probably the longest chapter we've read so far. Nothing in comparison to what we'll be reading in chapter 9 and 10 and 11. And then after that, if you're wondering, are we really going to be going chapter by chapter through each one of the divisions and the dedications? And the answer is no. We'll do it as an ensemble together and pull out those things, which often obviously are lists which way passes by. And it's not that there isn't things, and I don't believe there's a wasted scripture in the Bible anywhere. But the kind of understanding that we would need to study that is almost a verse by verse. Really happy to take ourselves back because we're so far removed from the culture of that and the understanding of where these places are that we'd have to fill so much blanks in that we could spend years trying to get through to that element. And so I just would rather give you an overview, because what we're trying to look at is what it is to go from receiving a promise to becoming a kingdom. And so there's a lot to study in those, and I will encourage you, of course that's the very pastor's thing to say, for you guys to go and study that on your own and find those gems and those things that are there. But hopefully you found Joshua chapter 8, and we're going to have a read of it together. It says, "Now the Lord said to Joshua, 'Do not be afraid nor be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and arise. Go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and its cattle you shall take as a booty for yourselves. Lay an ambush for the city behind it.' So Joshua arose, and all the people of war to go up against Ai. Joshua chose 30,000 men of valor and sent them away by night. And he commanded them, saying, 'Behold, they shall lie in ambush against the city, behind the city. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. And then I and all the people who are with me will approach the city. And it will come about when they come out against us at first, we shall flee before them. For they will come out after us till we have drawn them from the city. For they will say, they're fleeing before us as at the first. Therefore we will flee before them. Then you shall arise from the ambush, seize the city, and the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand.'" Verse 8.
"And it will be when you have taken the city that you shall set the city on fire. According to the commandment of the Lord you shall do. See, I have commanded you." Joshua therefore sent them out, and they went to lie in ambush and stayed between Bethel and Ai, on the west side of Ai. But Joshua lodged that night amongst the people. Then Joshua rose up early in the morning and mustered the people and went up, he and the elders of Israel, before the people of it to Ai. And all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near. And they came before the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now a valley lay between them and Ai. So he took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai on the west side of the city. And when they had set the people, all the army that was on the north of the city and its rear guard on the west of the city, Joshua went that night into the midst of the valley. Now it happened when the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried and rose early and went out against Israel to battle, he and all his people, at an appointed place before the plain. But he did not know there was an ambush against him behind the city. And Joshua and all Israel made as if they were beaten before them, and fled by the way of the wilderness. So all the people who were in Ai were called together to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. There was not a man left in Ai, or Bethel, who did not go out after Israel. So they left the city open and pursued Israel. 18.
Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Hold out towards Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city." So Joshua held out his javelin towards Ai. As soon as he did this, the men in the ambush rose quickly from their position and rushed forward. They entered the city and captured it and quickly set it on fire. The men of Ai looked back and saw the smoke of the city rising against the sky, but they had no chance to escape in any direction, for the Israelites who had been fleeing towards the desert had turned back against their pursuers. But when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city and that smoke was going up from the city, they turned round and attacked the men of Ai. The men of the ambush also came out of the city against them, so that they were caught in the middle with Israelites on both sides. Israel cut them down, leaving them neither survivors nor fugitives. But they took the king of Ai alive and brought him to Joshua. When Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the desert where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back the hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all who lived in Ai. But Israel did carry off for themselves the livestock and plunder of this city, as the Lord had instructed Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. He hung the king of Ai on a tree and left him there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take his body from the tree and throw it down at the entrance of the city gate, and they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day. 30.
Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded the Israelites. He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. On it they offered to the Lord burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings. There, in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on stones a copy of the law of Moses. All the Israelites, with their elders, officials, judges, were standing on both sides of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, facing the priests who carried it. Both the foreigners living among them and the native born were there. Half of the people stood in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had formerly commanded, when he gave instructions to bless the people. Afterward Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the cursings, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and the children and the foreigners who lived among them.
Amen. So Andrew is going to get wrapped up then in the wire, but it's okay. We came to his rescue, and he's now safe. It comes in. So we're here again in the history moments of our study of Joshua, and we're starting really to see, shall we say, that foothold moment when people take the land. And you've seen this development as we've kind of gone through the studies, first of all with Jericho, and now with this Ai. And the actual truth of it is that this chapter really does have to sit next to the one that went before it. But there's a part of us that might think this chapter only really exists because of the one that went before it. In other words, it's kind of got lots of little bits in it, but it's kind of like a process chapter to get us through to later chapters. And it's one of those things you read and you think, it's kind of interesting. It's not overly exciting. I'm going to be interested to see if there's anything really in this. And it also seems a bit of a mix of things that don't seem to connect together in any way, shape or form. If we remind ourselves from the last chapter, chapter 7, which we looked at, which of course is how they failed to take Ai, that we understand that the whole process was not just because Achan did something and everybody else paid for it, which is often the way that people like to look at it, because then they also like to look at that within, say, a church or an organization and say, well, you see, the reason that God isn't blessing our church, or God isn't blessing our family, or isn't blessing our organization is there's sin in our camp somewhere, and we need to root it out. And I tell you what, there's nothing like a good old-fashioned witch hunt to make a church come together in unity. But we start thrashing one another and go, is it you? Is it you? Ducking one another. If she floats, then we'll know she's a witch. And if she doesn't... And we're back into all of that kind of silly process that comes with it. There's nothing like that for destroying anything. And that isn't what the text taught us. It taught us that everybody was involved. Now, Achan did something, and everybody else didn't do the same thing as Achan, but they did it in the same spirit as Achan. And that is, they had a taste of victory, and it went to their head. And instead of worshipping God, they worshipped the worst idol of them all, yourself. That I kind of idol that comes in. And I remember hearing he was a wonderful man. He looked just like Harry Seacombe. And I say wonderful man, he's still alive. But he looked like Harry Seacombe. His name was Alan, and he used to give really powerful testimonies. He was from a really rough council estate in Stoke-on-Trent. He's in his 80s now, so he was talking about really kind of back then and getting into trouble, and how one day he found the Lord. He was the one that nobody wanted in the church because he was the trouble. And when he got saved and he got gloriously saved, he got an opportunity to preach, and he was so nervous about it. He really prayed and sought God about it, and he stood up and he preached a wonderful message. And a lot of people responded, and some people got saved. And his pastor said, why don't you preach again for us? Another message we'd like you to preach in a couple of weeks' time, or the second time. He said to himself, well, I could do this. I've got this. I've got this all in the bag. And he wrote his message down, and he said he stood up, and he read his Bible verse, and he read his message, and that was 5 minutes. He was supposed to preach for an hour. So he read the Bible verse again and read his message again. And in the end, the pastor had to stand up and he had to sit down. He said it was the most humbling experience of his life. And that is the sense of when we forget that it's God that gives us the strength. It's God that gives us the victory. And sometimes we do have these humbling moments that come. But of course, the issue that was here was that what Achan had taken were priestly garments, garments that were for worshipping other gods. It was the beginning of idolatry, and he and his family were punished along the lines of when a city or village became idolatrous. To take the leaven out, to stop it spreading through the whole lump, they were put together. But Achan had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to confess, not to man, but to God, and to cast away these things. And God made it very public over and over again, sanctify yourself, which means put these things away. Put them away. Because we know through the gospel message that the gospel message is that one day there will be a judgment. And that judgment will come when you die, or if you live and the Lord comes back again at the end of that time period. But there will be a judgment. It's the same event. You will all be brought to it. And only those who have Christ's book in front of them that says, prayed in full, well, they won't have to go to the courthouse. And if we think about this idea that God has been driving the prison van around and around the roundabout over and over again to stop the idea that one day he's going to have to drive into the courthouse, and then it's too late. Then you have to make the deal that comes to it. Now, that draws us deeper into this understanding of where we are. And if we move into this chapter, before I ask you what your questions are and what stands out to you from the chapter, because there may be a couple of things, and there's also one thing that people find a discrepancy that a lot of people want answers to. And if you haven't seen it, I'm not even going to mention it. But I'll see if you know it. And if it pops out at all, this has a lot of people torn. But, what's it about? And if we look at this very first verse of the chapter, it gives us, just such a beautiful statement. I mean, you can't deny as a Christian that it absolutely fills your heart with joy, particularly when you're reading in the Old Testament a lot of these dark chapters of death, when you see a statement like, do not be afraid, nor be dismayed. Yes, Lord. Yes. Thank goodness for that. It's got this wonderful revelation of merciful God. And sometimes you just need a little bit of light when it's been cloudy. Sometimes you just need to see a little bit of that to just shine down on you and say, merciful God. And it makes me smile, so I don't know if it makes you smile, to understand that every time I falter, there is this returning phrase, try again. Let's just try again. Get up and try again. Doesn't matter how many times you fall, as long as you get up one more time than you fall down. That's what's the most important. And this wonderful idea that it is the Lord who is behind that as a statement. Not something he's saying begrudgingly, not something he's saying through gritted teeth, not something he's forced to say because he made some promise to Joshua, but something that he wants to say. Try again. It's a precious thought, and it's not an incorrect view of what is going on here and what the Lord is saying to Joshua. And it's this phrase, do not be dismayed. Now, if I asked you, what do you think the word dismay means? I mean, if we ask the young people if they've ever used the word dismay in their life, other than reading it in the Bible, I can't think I've ever used the word dismay in my life. Sounds like, I don't know, dismay. Is that something, what would you interpret that word as being?
It's not quite despair, but it's fear, and anxiety heading in the direction of despair.
Yes, I like that as a good definition. So it's on the road of despair, but not quite there. Near enough, though. That's it. Now, the Hebrew word is kor fatha, which would put me into despair. And it has a number of different meanings, and of course every word, when a word's translated, doesn't mean it means all of them. But the one that would fit into this meaning here that fits it is to be broken. And I think that really grasps the situation here. So do not be afraid, don't be broken. And that now really has to kind of make us ask a question. And it sits well with us when we know the heart of the Lord and we see the calling that Jesus quotes from Isaiah of himself. Remember what he says? I am here to bind up the brokenhearted. And that's a great and wonderful promise we like to know about the Lord. He is here to bind up the brokenhearted. And if you kind of take that as a phrase, I think you could probably get 10 people in a room and get 10 different ideas of what being broken-hearted is about. Now, we could all be broken-hearted over different things, and we should never laugh at those kind of things because it's very different in different circumstances. I've known people to be broken-hearted over the death of a pet. And you think, wow, well, that's silly. How can you get broken-hearted over that? There's far more serious things that are going on in the world. And believe me, people who find themselves in a situation where they're so broken over the death of a pet tell themselves that all the time. Right, it's just a cat. Why are you letting yourself get so upset about this? But actually, when it comes to losing companions, it comes to losing friends, it comes to losing family, it comes to losing anybody, there's no line to say who it is going to make you more broken-hearted than who isn't. In fact, sometimes you may not even know who's going to make you more broken-hearted than who is. There are sometimes you weep uncontrollably, and other times you're thinking, I should be weeping uncontrollably here. And I don't seem to be. I seem to be fine about it. You know, this weekend, most of my family, apart from the boy, but it's his turn soon, we've all had this vomiting bug, which is why I wasn't here at the weekend. We've been really, really poorly with it, actually. It's been like a 24-hour thing that comes over. And anybody that knows my youngest daughter knows that she can cut her finger with a paper cut and it'd be like the worst murder that's ever happened. She could scream the place down. She once fell over on her roller skates out here and half the street came out and thought somebody was being stabbed. And that is not a joke. They genuinely thought that's what was happening, the noise that was coming out of it. And yet she's been smiling in between vomiting all the way through this weekend, which is not her at all in any way, shape or form. It's freaking me out. But that comes along. People are broken-hearted and react differently in different situations about different things. So it would be wrong to try and say that as a generic, this is what being broken-hearted is. It's to understand that Jesus will bind the broken-hearted. Rock bottom is a different place for a lot of different people. Where you need to be bound is that. And there is no line that says, well, just because X, Y, and Z can cope with these issues and you can't, that means you're a weaker person or you don't deserve this. Jesus said, I have come to bind the broken-hearted. And he calls out to that one who's in that moment of brokenness. But what's Joshua broken about? Now that's a good kind of jump at it. And I say that because we may think that since it's in the same sentence as the Lord also saying, don't be afraid, that what he's actually upset about is that they were allowed to be defeated. Now, if you remember his confession, this statement that he made in Joshua 7, just read verses 6 to 9 in Joshua chapter 7. Remember this.
Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the earth on his face before the ark of the Lord until the evening, he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. And Joshua said, Alas, O Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all, to give us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us? Would that we had been content to dwell beyond the Jordan.
That's very good. Now, it's absolutely true. That's a statement of brokenness and despair. That's a statement of despair and dismay. But it's not an acceptable statement of despair and dismay. It's an absolute rejection of all that God has given him at the first time that any kind of hardship has come his way. I mean, he's standing in the rubble of Jericho and saying, oh God, why aren't you fighting for us? And we know that that's clearly not acceptable. That it can't be this case that, you know, I always forget the words of the song, but it's count your blessings, count them every one. All right. That's it. And I mean, if you've ever heard these ideas about keeping a prayer journal, I make the Nazarites do this every Tuesday. They have to fill out their prayer journal, the things that they're praying for, and have any of these come true. And they're useful in a sense of encouraging yourself to keep going back, particularly when you're going through a time of it, to say, well, I know that the Lord has moved in my life. And if you can reject those concepts that go through your idea that, oh, well, God's abandoned me, because he doesn't do that, then you know that if it's quiet at this moment in time, that's because you're exactly where the Lord wants you to be, even if it's not where you want to be. And we hold on to the promise that he will be with us until the end of the age. But we know that Joshua's statement was not a confession. It was guilt, but a declaration of unbelief. That's what he was declaring. I don't believe in you anymore, God, because you've let me down this time. And so the Lord's saying, just get up. And as such, if you think about it from a New Testament point of view, that has a resonance with Peter. And if you think about Peter and denying Jesus those 3 times, you know, he denied Christ. But if we think about what the reason was behind him denying Christ, was they were identifying him as being with Christ. And Christ at that time was under arrest. They were mounting a crowd around Peter. It was looking like actually this crowd could start on him. He could get beaten. He could get abused. And so he made the decision to lie outright. But what his statement is not a self-preservation one. It's one that I don't trust that God can save me. because there he is tied up. And you could say, oh, well, he should have been prepared to die with Jesus next to him. After all, those were his words. He did say that's what he would do. But he is doing exactly the same thing. He, looking at Jesus, is saying, I don't believe that you can save me in this moment. By saying, I tell you, I don't know the man. And as Peter was then utterly racked with guilt from that moment on, and rushed away, and was in this place where he couldn't be comforted, and the minute he heard the story or the women's report, he was the first one out the door, bolting off to see if he could see. And that when Jesus saw him on the shore, he dived out of the boat and swam as fast as he could to get to the shore to see Jesus. We see that in Joshua this same rack of guilt. And so, although the scripture doesn't tell us that he felt guilty, it wouldn't be wrong for us to make this leap, this educated jump, to suggest that what it means by don't be dismayed is, don't let this failure, don't let this moment of defeat, don't let this moment where you didn't believe now define you. He had let the Lord down and fallen short of his commission. Remember, what was his commission? Be strong and very courageous. In other words, be tunnel-minded. I've called you to this. And this concept and idea that God would miraculously bring you across the Jordan, miraculously destroy the greatest power in the area, so that now it's a fair game for everyone, in order to watch you die at the hand of a small village, makes God out to be nothing more than all the cruel gods that surrounded. This idea that he was like the Greek fates. Or this idea, you see in the Jason and the Argonauts films, where they're all playing chess with real people's lives. And moving them from here, there, and everywhere. And that isn't how the Lord will be seen. He is a merciful God. So the restoration which the Lord gives to Joshua is try again at Ai. Don't be dismayed. Don't be afraid. Now let's go for it. Now remember, how did they go for it the first time? Took 3,000. Against how many? 12,000. So they had a staggeringly arrogance that they could subdue anybody. And they needed to learn something. Yes, God has planned that the inhabitants of this land will be driven from their land. Because of their wickedness, the land is rejecting them. But don't think that they're going to go easy. And don't think that they're a soft touch. They are a warlike people. And you're going to have to fight. And that's why you have to understand, if the Lord isn't for you, the enemy is powerful. It tells us this about Satan. It says, don't rebuke him directly. Even Michael, the archangel, wouldn't rebuke the devil directly, but said, the Lord rebuke you. And that is the same for us. We have authority in the name of Jesus. The authority is the name of Jesus, not our authority. We have no authority. And if we try to fight the enemy in our own strength, he is powerful. And he will tear you to pieces. So you have to fight him in Jesus' strength. And that is essential. And that's why we wear our spiritual armor. And why we're told that in this world we're to be meek as lambs. But in the spiritual world, we're to be as fierce as lions. Battling. Swords drawn. Ready to wage war against an enemy that is not flesh and blood, but is spiritual in every aspect. And if we understand that Joshua is told, try again at Ai, we can also make a connection to the fact that, like Peter, who thought he'd blown it, then Joshua's fear and dismay was that he'd blown it by failing to take Ai. And because he'd failed to take Ai, everything's off. Everything's done now. I failed at the hurdle I was supposed to jump. And you might think, well, what's so important about AI? Why not just go a different way then? Because there are plenty of villages, cities, and towns that we will come across and hold this fort for many weeks' time, where they didn't subdue the Canaanites. And the Lord doesn't say get back up again and try again. They go a different direction and they go this way. So why does it have to be Ai? Why is it that Joshua seemed to think by not destroying Ai, he'd failed? And why is it that God tells him to go back to Ai? What is it about this place that means this has to happen for the promise to happen? And the simple answer to that question has to be, because this is what was next on the Lord's plan. And you go, well, that's a pretty obvious answer. But more than that, Ai had to be taken. But if Ai had to be taken, we might ask, why? Since what Israel do is they utterly destroy it. They don't turn it back into a new Israelite village. And they don't destroy every village now. From now on, they don't go around destroying the towns and the villages. But in this case, Ai, like Jericho, had to go. It had to be destroyed. And I think if you start to ask those kind of questions, this is what throws the overview into light for us. Because when reading the chapter, what have we got? Well, we've got two completely unconnected events. We've got this whole battle of Ai, and then this ritual from verse 30 to 35. So much so that many commentators are convinced that it's in the wrong place. And these are people that like to kind of pull holes in the Bible anyway, but a lot of them then, those teachings find their way into the mainstream, and people say, oh, it was a mistake. This should really be somewhere around about chapter 13. Because it can't possibly be where it is, because they don't have this land yet. You see, what reconciles these two complete different parts with the Lord's restoration of Joshua and the command to destroy Ai is not that Ai is important, but that it was in the way or on the way of what was important. The ritual at the end of the chapter. See, because if you read it now, if you're a boy like me and you like a good war story, then the first part's all exciting, it's all action and adventure, and priests and people and altars. And you know, the book of Numbers was like that. Here's a load of action, and then here's a chapter about why there's almond blossoms on the side of the candelabras. But it always ended up being the chapters about the almond blossoms on the side of the candelabras that had more to teach us than the ones about Korah or Dathan or On or any of these other kind of stories and characters that we come around. I remember the woman with the jar of dirt. That one went down a storm. So all of these kind of things is you've got this bit at the end that doesn't seem important, but the bit in the end is what is important. And Ai is just on the way to it. And that begs the question, what is important about the ritual of this last part, that Ai had to be totally consumed and destroyed? And how was Ai in the way of that? Now, to answer that, Joshua chapter 8 and verses 30 to 31 give us some clues. So let's have a read of that. Joshua 8, 30 to 31.
Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel. As Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites, he built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones on which no iron tool had been used. On it they offered to the Lord burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings.
Thank you very much. So we've got a couple of things that jump out to us from that. Firstly, the importance is the location. It's Mount Ebal. Now, verse 33 then also gives us another mountain next to it, Mount Gerizim. And so the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, you've got Ebal, the valley, and Gerizim. So this location becomes important. And the valley between these two mountainous peaks. Secondly, what Joshua was going to do to these locations was something which Moses had commanded the children of Israel. So he was actually going here because he had prior orders to go here. They came to him before they even crossed over the promised land. But actually, what's most important about these orders is they're not just an oral command. Now, the thing we have to remember about the Jewish spiritual books, we have the Pentateuch here, which is the 5 books of the law. We have the rest of the Old Testament, which they call the Torah. But there are other religious books in Judaism, and the Haggadah is one of them. And this is what we call the oral traditions, or, as is often brought up in the New Testament, the traditions of the elders, to which Jesus found himself quite regularly breaking. But that's because they were made by men, and they were contradictory. In fact, Jesus found himself both keeping and breaking them at the same time, which is one of these kind of crazy notions that comes. But a lot of those oral traditions were not godless or wrong. And a lot of them came from Moses. They never found themselves in the Bible because they were not, well, what is the Bible? What differentiates the Bible from any other book? It's inspired by God. And that's what's important. And it's not to say that it wasn't said with wisdom. It wasn't said using scriptural understanding that Moses said any of these things. But they are not included in the Word of God because the Word of God doesn't just apply to the people it was said to. It applies to all the world because Jesus said not one jot or tittle will pass away until the end of the age, until the completion of all things. And so it has a relevance to us, and that means that not everything that Moses said has a relevance to us, but it did have a relevance to them. But this isn't in any of that oral law. It's in the Pentateuch. So they are following something that was put in the law for all of posterity to read. In other words, for you and I to read. And Joshua was enacting something that God had put for Moses to put in the law so that all the generations that would ever come, including those at Grace Pentecostal Church Blackburn's Bible study tonight, would have instruction in how to draw closer to the Lord in relationship. And that's important to us. And so to understand that, we need to read it. So just turn with me. We're going to read the whole chapter. It's not a very long chapter. It's Deuteronomy 27. It's getting there. Yay. Anyway, hopefully you found it. Deuteronomy 27. What I'm going to say to you is keep a finger in both of them because we may do a little bit of flicking back. Or if you haven't got a finger, a stick of bacon, anything you've got on you really.
Then Moses and the elders of Israel charged the people, saying, Keep all the commandments which I command you today. So it shall be on the day when you shall cross the Jordan to the land which the Lord your God gives you, that you shall set up for yourself large stones and coat them with lime, and write on them all the words of this law. when you cross over, in order that you may enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. So it shall be when you cross the Jordan, you shall set up on Mount Ebal these stones as I have commanded you today, and you shall coat them with lime. Moreover, you shall build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not wield an iron tool on them. You shall build the altar of the Lord your God of uncut stones, and you shall offer on it burnt offerings to the Lord your God. And you shall sacrifice peace offerings and eat there, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God. And you shall write on the stones all the words of this law very distinctly. Then Moses and the Levitical priests spoke to all Israel, saying, Be silent and listen, O Israel. This day you have become a people for the Lord your God. You shall therefore obey the Lord your God and do his commandments and his statutes which I command you today. Moses also charged the people on that day, saying, When you cross the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. And for the curse, these shall stand on Mount Ebal: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. The Levites shall then answer and say to all the men of Israel with a loud voice, Cursed is the man who makes an idol or a molten image, an abomination to the Lord, the work of the hands of the craftsman, and sets it up in secret. And all the people shall answer and say, Amen. Cursed is he who dishonours his father and mother, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who moves his neighbour's boundary mark, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who misleads a blind person on the road, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who distorts the justice due an alien, orphan and widow, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who lies with his father's wife, because he has uncovered his father's skirt, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who lies with any animal, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who lies with his sister, the daughter of his father or of his mother, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who lies with his mother-in-law, goodness, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who strikes his neighbour in secret, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who accepts a bribe to strike down an innocent person, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who does not confirm the words of this law by doing them, and all the people shall say, Amen.
Amen. No, I told you it wasn't, which is unusual for Deuteronomy. But the actual understanding there, that you start to see this is what you're going to have to go and do, Joshua. So this is what Joshua's gone to do. And he's taken everybody with him, because it's clear that everybody has to go with them. So if everybody's going with them, they're off on that way. Now, the thing about what we see here in the last 5 verses of Joshua 8, and what we read in Deuteronomy 27, is Joshua 8 is really an overview of that. So we don't get a word-for-word account that they did exactly the same thing. But what we can say is, we don't get an understanding that Joshua kind of changed a few things. So what Joshua is really doing is, Joshua 8 gives us the most important elements of that, which relate to what we need to learn. And Joshua 27 is this declaration that when you're in the promised land, this is the thing that you need to do. Now, is it the first thing that they did? Why isn't it the first thing that they did? And that's exactly the understanding. And shortly, not yet, Daniel will be putting a slide up for us, because occasionally we need a map to help us here when it comes to Israel geography. We're kind of trying to grasp our ideas, but Janet's spot on there. They are further north. And the problem was Jericho and Ai are in the way. But now Jericho's gone. Ai has to be next so that they can go. Why? Because if everybody's going, and we already know that Gilgal is where they will end up going back to, and Gilgal is where they do all of their battles from. This is their base camp. And what else was put at Gilgal? Can you remember? The stones. And where did the stones come from? Jordan. So what was that to remind them of? It reminds them of the crossing, but it also reminds them they couldn't have got hold of those stones if God hadn't separated the waters. And the extent of when you have a Joshua-esque moment, go back to Gilgal and have a look at those stones and tell yourself, would God really bring us across the Jordan in order to watch us die? It's a constant reminder that God is with you. And without God, on your own, there's no strength. And of course, what else did they do at Gilgal? All the boys must remember this. Circumcision. Everybody was recircumcised, and they had a Passover. Not recent. Well, you say you can't, but they were circumcised again because the nation hadn't been circumcised since Sinai, and they were once again brought into the covenant, so that they were a part of that. So we see all of that. Now, it shows the highlights, but doesn't show all. And then Joshua 8:34 to 35 shows that Joshua read the whole of the law to them from these two starting points. So once they're up there, he reads the whole law to, starting with Deuteronomy 28 and 29. The blessings to those who keep the law and the cursings to those who break it. And it's this kind of central point. But why was this so important that the Lord had contained it within the law for us to read even today? After all, it really is only an event that is relevant to Joshua. Nobody else is going to get to go and do this. He's already done it. Why say it in there? Do Israel have to do this again? Is it going to be done again? Is it something that's going to be done in the millennial kingdom? Is it an event that should be repeated? Well, I don't believe that any of that's true, but it does have to have something to speak to us. So if we look at what Joshua does record from Deuteronomy 27, we see the important points are, first, the setting up of the altars from unworked stones. So why is it important that the stones are not cut, chopped, worked, carved? That's exactly right. They could very much start worshipping the altar itself. And in fact, that happens if you think about the pole that Moses holds up with the S, the brass snake on it, and the cross formation. By the time of Hezekiah, he has to break it into pieces. It's got its own temple and its own name. It's being worshipped now, when it was only looking up to it to say that God could heal it. So it's very true that that can happen. Now, think about that in, shall we say, our own histories. I know that the pastor at Preston, he felt the desperate need to have to sell the church building and move into rented accommodation because he couldn't move the church any further forward because people worshipped the building. Because it was one of the original buildings. They'd had it this, and it was bought by such and such, and that seat, and this tablet, and that stone, and this wall, and that window. And I'm sure you've all experienced that kind of, it can't be, this is my pew, and that's my seat, and I've been here, and that's why I keep changing the seats. So you can't get to know one you like. It's not yours. They've all been moved. But you understand that people very much start worshipping. You know, they could start worshipping God and start worshipping the worship. They could start worshipping God and listening to his word and worshipping the preacher or the teacher. They could stop any of those kind of things, and it sneaks up on you so quickly. So that's a good reason. Any other reasons? God said not. Where did God say not? He did, and let's have a look at that. Exodus chapter 20, verses 22 to 25. Now, as you're turning to that, what else do we read in Exodus 20? It's a very important and well-known chapter in the Bible. It's the Ten Commandments. Remember, with the Ten Commandments, God actually came down to the people. And they said, no, Moses, you go. And they stood back, and Moses said, don't be afraid. God wants to commune with you. And they went, no, you go. So what do we read in Exodus 20, 22 to 25? The law about altars.
You should not have...
The Lord said to Moses, "This is what you shall tell the sons of Israel. You yourself have seen that I have talked to you from heaven. You shall most certainly not make alongside of me gods of silver, nor gods of gold."
Exodus 20,
Yeah?
22,
25.
Yeah?
22 to 25. Yeah, jumping in then. Start again, Annie.
Yeah, I'll start again. The Lord said to Moses, "This is what you shall tell the sons of Israel. You yourself have seen that I have talked to you from heaven. You shall most certainly not make alongside of me gods of silver, or gods of yourselves. You shall make an altar of the earth for me, and shall sacrifice on it burnt offerings and peace offerings. Your sheep and your cattle in every place which I have recorded my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of cut stone, for if you lift up your tool on it, you have polluted it."
So we see a couple of things that jump out to us from there. Now bear in mind this is with the giving of the 10 words, the 10 commandments. Firstly, see why it's in the law. Israel is not to just erect an altar to God wherever it likes. It must only be, it says there, in a place of God's choosing. And Joshua has it in the law. God has chosen Mount Ebal. I bet you never heard of Mount Ebal before today, had you? But there you go. There's God choosing Mount Ebal. And Mount Ebal is the place that you're going to put my name on. So it must be something that God has chosen. And it has to be in... Go on. What?
No, I was going to say it's also something God's created, isn't it? If nobody noticed.
Yes, that's true as well. So stone that nobody else has had the hands on means that only one master craftsman's got his hands on them. And that's the Lord himself, who is the builder and the creator of all things. And that's very true as well. So God is the architect. Of course, it gives to us a great big jump to what Daniel tells us, where Nebuchadnezzar has this dream of this statue made of different stones, and then a great big stone comes and smashes the feet. Now that sits for us, but Joshua doesn't know that dream yet, because it's not that time. This is 400 or 500 years in the future yet. So, well, actually, much longer than that. So it gives us a feeling on that. But we also understand in every place in which Jehovah should bring his name to remembrance. That's the rule. It can only be in a place that that the Lord wants his name to be brought as a remembrance. In other words, it's a place or a site of posterity for all generations to come. And so this law reveals to us the reason that it's in the Pentateuch, it's in Deuteronomy 27, and the reason that therefore Joshua does it in Joshua 8 is so that all generations to come, including us, understand that God has put his name on this mountain for everybody to know about, not just the people of the time. So the people of the time, maybe the people who did it and did the ritual, but the Lord's name and that altar may not still be there, and I should imagine they're not still there. But the Bible lets us know it was there. And the posterity of it is there for all eternity. And so that we always know that and understand it. But it won't have carved ornate images on it, so that the altar itself becomes the object of worship. Also, none of the creators of the altar become worshipped. Only God is worshipped. But finally, here's the most important thing. God may have created the stones, but who could have put them up there on the altar? Well, anybody could. And this is the most important element. Anybody could be a part of the creation of this altar building. Not just the people who were skilled stonemasons. Anybody. You didn't need to have the skill, you needed to have the heart. You needed to have the willingness to be a part of putting something together that was part of the worship of God. It wasn't done by craftsmen, it was done by the everyday. And that's where the Lord's name would be remembered. And that gives us quite a lot. It's understanding that no one is excluded from partaking in the building of the altar of worship. Nobody is precluded from worship. Only those who preclude themselves. And remember, that's a choice because your spirit was created to worship. So you have to actually suppress that within you. So you have to deliberately stop yourself from worshipping because you will naturally worship God. Because we naturally worship. Joshua also highlighted that the law is written upon the stones. So what do you think that means? You think that means all 5 books? And that's a lot of people would argue it's that. Some think it's the book of Deuteronomy. And the problem with being the book of Deuteronomy is it is only a highlighted section. The idea of it being the whole Bible, or the whole of the Pentateuch, is this concept that would take a lot of work. And it'd have to be a very long and tall. Bear in mind, what language, what would be the style, how would it be written? It'd be written in Hebrew letters. To what point? They'd have to be on scaffolding to get this, and it would take months to write all of that. If you think when we do the Bible reading, it takes us an entire day to read from Genesis through to Deuteronomy. That's always the first day, and we usually end up around about here in Joshua. So it's a long kind of lot. So it's very unlikely. Most people agree, and I agree with what Janet has said then, it's the 10 words. Now, what's significant about the 10 Commandments? Well, touche. But you could say on that. But I mean in terms of the rest of the law. Some people think it's the summing up of the law. But is that right? No, because Jesus says the summing up of the law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbours as yourself. And not only did Jesus say that, so did the Jewish lawyers. So they all were agreed on this moment. But the 10 Commandments are not, as people kind of put them out there, as 10 Commandments. They're actually the 10 diagnoses of man's sinful condition. In giving the 10 Commandments, the children of Israel say, "You go, Moses." Because we have now just seen the nature of God and how far short we are of it. Now think about that. It's the diagnosis of man's sinful state. And it's going to be set up in this place now forevermore. Israel had started at Sinai, where they received the 10 Commandments. And the first outing of the 10 Commandments was for them to be smashed at their feet. Because they'd fallen short already. So now they were challenged to set up the law in a solemn manner in Canaan. It had happened in a foreign land. Now they were in their own land. They've crossed the Jordan. They're into the promise. They've destroyed that was in the way to stop them getting to this place. And now that they have the ability to get to this place, they can make this reference. The 10 words, the 10 commandments, the diagnosis of man is set up on a mount, on a hill. That's completely different to Gilgal. Gilgal was the place of the memorial stones, a place to set up as the power of God, a reminder that God is bringing about this promise. Now the declaration was that the promised land was one under the law of God. To get from Gilgal to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, they had to go through Ai. Had they left it, and all of the people had gone to Mount Ebal, the people of Ai would have gone to Gilgal. I would have taken everything. And when that hope is gone, that's why it was one of the words that was shared. The foundation has to be protected. The devil isn't interested in getting you to argue whether you believe in a pre or mid-tribulation rapture. He's more interested in getting you to say, I don't believe that God is real. Now, he may do that by getting you to fall out with a load of people over mid-tribulation or pre-tribulation rapture, but that's a completely different story. His end goal is to destroy your foundations, so you have to protect the way. And it wasn't entirely protected. They'd left it, and they'd marched up here. They'd gone to this place, and Gilgal was still left exposed. But now there was that faith in the Lord. They were coming to do what God had called them to do. All Israel went to set up these altars. But why did it have to be Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, do you think? We have to say that now. Because of what's in the middle. What's in the middle? Shechem. No. Shechem isn't in the middle, but it is near. That's what I told you it wasn't. It isn't in the middle. There is obviously a valley in the middle, and something very important comes in the valley in the middle. And you're right, it is what's in the middle, but it's not Shechem. Put me the slide up, Daniel. Let's put everybody out of their misery. Let's see if you can see this slide now. I'm going to run all the way over here. So, in the red, it says Mount Ebal. And it says Mount Gerizim. I know it's a Shechem there, but it's to the side of it. Please start getting excited. What came in the middle of it was Shiloh. But we'll come back to that. Now have a look at Israel. That's dead in the center. Right in the middle of the nation, God sets up. Right in the heart of the people, God sets up this altar. It's bang slap in the middle of it all. It's right there at where it needs to be to make a declaration. Bang in the middle of the country at the heart. But it's the third thing which Joshua records from Deuteronomy 27. We find it in verse 33, and it says this. Then all Israel, with the elders and the officers and the judges, stood on either side of the ark before the priests, the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as he who bore among them. Half of them were in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them on Mount Ebal, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded. Because we have a picture that's before us. Everybody's worshipping. Peace offerings are about giving a free will offering. Not something you are demanded to do, but something you choose to give. Everybody is worshipping in that. Peace offerings, David likens to being the worship that we understand today. You have all of Israel surrounding the ark. The ark is in the middle of this valley. And all of the nation of Israel are on one mountain, on the other mountain. They're designated with 4 banners. The banner of the lion, the banner of the ox, the banner of the man's face, and the banner of the eagle. And the elders, and the priests, and they're all surrounding the mercy seat, the throne of God. What does this remind you of? Let's turn to Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4, and again, it's not a long chapter, so we're going to read it all.
I After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet, speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne, in appearance like an emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures, full of eyes in the front and in the back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature like a calf, the third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. The four living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes around and within, and they do not rest day or night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever. The 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created.
The throne room of heaven, as described. When we read Numbers 4, we see the camp of Israel. The tabernacle in the middle, right in the middle of the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, right in the middle of the Holy of Holies, the Ark of God, and right in the middle of the Ark of God, the throne, the mercy seat of God. And we know that it is on the mercy seat that the atonement is given. It is to the mercy seat that we throw ourselves. It's in the mercy seat that we're boldly considered to come in, draw closer to the Lord, draw close to that mercy seat of God. And this is that representation. Having cleared the way, they made their way to the heart of Israel, and they set up a representation of the throne of heaven. And to all those people who are still believing in the wrong kind of millennialism, this idea that we are creating a perfect world, and then Jesus will come back, here again you see, the throne comes first. Then the world is made perfect. And this is the case. It's the same with you. Jesus has to come in before you're made perfect. He has to be the king on your heart before he's made perfect. It is not a case, it's not even a military significant idea to believe that the generals are supposed to get the place ready before the king arrives. It never happens. It's always the leader who has to bring them through, and he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But more importantly than that, this area would later be called Shiloh. Shiloh is where the tabernacle would come to rest. We never hear about the tabernacle again, really, apart from the odd little bits here and there. It's where the people would go to seek the Lord. Hannah would weep on the steps here. David would flee from Saul here. The ark would be brought back to Jerusalem. These are all these places. But this time between the testimony of the law, that all who dare to venture towards the mercy seat have to first of all see the altar with the 10 words on. Because if you want to go to the mercy seat in your own strength, then you've got to go past the 10 commandments first. There's a barrier. In the middle, in the heart of the nation where the law is, the mercy seat is still out of reach. Because you can't get close to the 10 words. They diagnose your condition and tell you you need the mercy seat. However, the road to here, the road through AI, the road that allows the mercy seat to be, we read this in verse 29. And the king of Ai, he hung on a tree until evening. And as soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded they take his corpse from the tree, cast it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raise over it a great heap of stones that remains to this day. For them to be able to get to that place, one has to be hung upon a tree. And then buried. But only with the resurrection can you get to the mercy seat. King of Ai didn't die for his people. But the people of God couldn't get to the heart until he was hung. Cursed is he who hangs on a tree. And as Jesus was hung until evening and then was buried at the gate in the gardens of Gethsemane, in the stone tomb that was created for another man, a rich man, who willingly gave it up. And so surprisingly, to understand what the overview of this chapter is, we have to know the second first before we can understand the first part. Because this isn't about AI. And it's not even about Joshua's restoration. It's about the establishment of the throne of heaven in the center of all that will be done. The throne of heaven in the center of all that we've been done. The first thing that you have to establish in your life, the first thing you have to establish in your life when Jesus has brought you into his promise is that you make a place of praise within yourself. That you establish that throne within your heart as being a place of praise. Remember what Jesus said to the woman at the well, I am looking for worshippers who worship in spirit and in truth. In the truth of your situation, that say when you're happy, I worship God because he is the author and finisher of my life and faith. And when I am sad, I worship God because to whom else can I go? I may not want to be here at the moment, but there's nowhere else that's better. And in both situations, don't dance your cares away. That's what the world does. But draw before the King of Heaven and worship and glorify him. Establish his throne. Worship is an act of faith. And that faith helps you to make Jesus Lord in your life and have more command and more authority over your life and in the parts of your life. And that's why the children of Israel had to do this. Jericho and Ai were in the way, but once they were gone, they stretched out a long way what would be bad military advice, and they created. Soon Shechem would come close to it, where Joseph's bones were buried, and we will look at that when we get to chapter 24. And Shechem was the place where they started to name the kings. All of this was present until Jerusalem, the bride. Because the people who say, well, the New Testament wasn't there before. Why would God change his mind and go from this to that? Because God went from Shiloh to Jerusalem. He went to the bride. She had to be bought. She had to be worked upon. But in the end, a throne was established. Now from here, from Shiloh, from this moment where they are at the end of chapter 8, You'd think this is a great place. I mean, blooming heck, you're right in the middle of the country. And you're on 2 mountains. Doesn't get any better than that. They'd be able to stretch out and take the land. But they were not able to stay at Shiloh. Because they read the law. They read the blessings. And they read the cursings. And then they made an altar that showed they'd already fallen short of the glory of God. So instead, they went back to Gilgal. Not as an act of defeat, but as an act of understanding. I'm only in the promised land because God made a way. And he circumcised my heart. And the Passover lamb was sacrificed so that I, the guilty one, may go free. Amen. Amen. So, that's our overview. So let me ask you, since there's so much we haven't talked about in this chapter, what jumps out at you? Why do you think it was stupid of what they did? And that's a very good point. Why would you run out of the stronghold situation? And that actually gets onto really the next kind of element, understanding the AI side of that. So I'm going to say a bit about that. They may answer a few questions you've got around the AI side, but it will lead. I won't immediately give the answer to what Jan has just said, but it is a great statement, and it's an understanding. Why would you do that? Why would you give up your strong position? Especially when you start to think what Israel's coming against you with. Now, one of the dark and hard things about the Old Testament is when we read about the death of women and non-combatants. Shall we say the genocide of a whole town. It's always difficult to get your head around. And I'd phrase this question because I thought somebody might want to know the answer to that question, really. Well, why is this okay, or why does this happen? I think it's always important to study these things, not shy away from them, because they're a bit difficult to answer. And we begin by looking at the Lord's command to Joshua to get a satisfactory answer, especially what he says in verse 2. So what does he say in verse 2 to? Joshua 8:2. Just so you're not reading Deuteronomy 27 now.
You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the city.
So what part of you'll do to Ai what you did to Jericho? Because clearly they didn't walk around it 7 times. Destroy them. But there is an element that's with that. Destroy what? Because they're not destroying this time all the other bits, the livestock and the gold. They haven't even got to give it to God this time. They get to keep the lot. So the only things that have got to die are the people and the buildings. They're the things. The tents are getting it again. Wicked tents. They're getting. So that's all that's going. And that's all that's got to be the case. And that's the bit that's kind of... Now let's just have a look back at Joshua 6 and let's read verses 17 to 19. Because this is what it's talking about in how everything should be treated. Joshua 6, 17 to 19.
Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you, by all means, abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord.
So the thing was that it was all devoted to God. It was under the ban. So everything was God's, just like Jericho was, and that's what it means when it says, as you did to Jericho, you will to Ai. In other words, this is to be devoted to the Lord. except for this time, you can keep the other things. Now remember that rejecting this command, stealing from the Lord, not taking the opportunity to deal with it before the day of judgment, and therefore showing that Achan either didn't believe in God or didn't believe the Lord would do anything about it, cost not just him or his family or his tent, but Israel a great deal for the punishment for being idolatrous. So, if you remember that, that's the power of the devoted thing. So here's the challenge the second time. We're not going to go the same way as we did with Jericho. Everything that's here is under the ban. Everything is God's. Ai was to be exactly the same, except not the items within it, just the city, the people themselves. And if we remember what being under the ban is, just turn with me quickly to Leviticus 27, and let's just read verse 29. This is the important phrase, verse 29 of Leviticus 27. It's the last chapter in Leviticus.
No one devoted who shall be devoted from among men shall be ransomed, he shall surely put to death.
No one shall be ransomed. Anybody got a different word to ransomed? Set apart for destruction. Anybody got redeemed? Redemption. Redeemed, redeemed. And it's that, understand, redeemed. Nobody who is under the ban can be redeemed. Now think about that. Did Achan get a chance to be redeemed? Yes. Until he got caught. Until the moment he was given all these opportunities to drop it out. Was anybody in Jericho given the chance to be redeemed? Rahab and all the family. What did they all have to do? They had to come to the Lord before the day of judgment arrived. They all had to do it before the day of judgment. Do we read about anybody being redeemed out of the Ai? And that starts to reveal to you a little bit about what is different about the people of Ai. So how did they become unredeemable? And we can come to the conclusion that because of the blessings of Abraham, because they had killed Israelites in chapter 7, then they were cursed, because anyone who curses you, I will curse. And so there's this kind of thing that falls on them. But we might think, well, what about the non-combatants? Why this entire genocide element that is with it? Surely they aren't going to be under the same rule. Surely they are innocent of the intention of the others. And you can even argue, well, the children of Israel came up against them. So in fairness, they were just defending their own homes. Well, to innocence. And that's the key word. Innocence. We often apply it to things that aren't. To innocence, we can see the scripture actually gives us the answer. So what was the Lord's battle plan in verse 2? Ambush. It's really clear, isn't it? I mean, it's like, ooh. Now, that might not really mean anything to you, because that's exactly what they do, and that's how it works. But a lot of commentators have a problem with this. Because setting an ambush is not lawful. It's against the law of God to set an ambush. And he is God telling them to set an ambush. Does God change his mind? Does God set aside his law? Is God under his own law? Yes. And these are all important. Otherwise, Jesus wouldn't need to have died on the cross, and he just went, you guys are free. So we have to understand why ambushes are unlawful. So turn with me to Deuteronomy 19, and let's read verses 11 to 13. Deuteronomy 19, verses 11 to 13.
But if anyone hates his neighbour and lies in wait for him and attacks him and strikes him fatally so that he dies, and he flees to one of these cities, Sorry, do I carry on?
To verse 13, please.
Right. Then the elders of his city shall send and take him from there and hand him over to the avenger of blood, so that he may die. Your eyes shall not pity him, but you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from Israel, so that it may be well with you.
What are the cities that it's talking about? The cities of refuge. The whole chapter is actually talking about not allowing innocent blood or the cost of innocent blood to dwell over everybody. And in this particular element, it's talking about what can't be seen as manslaughter. If you're carrying a baseball bat around in your car and the police stop you and they say, why have you got a baseball bat in your car? If the answer isn't, I like baseball, or somewhere along the lines of, it's for self-defense, you'll find yourself very quickly being arrested, because that's intent to do grievous bodily harm. You are arming yourself in order to hurt somebody else, even if it is in self-defense. So the answer that came back, if you were carrying a cudgel, that was not manslaughter, because why are you carrying a cudgel? You intended to do harm. There were lots of ways that they had to explore the difference between somebody who killed somebody accidentally and somebody who killed somebody on purpose. The family were obliged by law for the avenger of blood to come and strike you dead. They were required to do it, to avenge the blood of the one that was dead. And this is why we don't let victims set prison sentences, because it will always be disproportionate and will be entirely based on their rage and on their wrath. So the avenger of the blood might not care that you were swinging an axe and the head flew off it. You've called Uncle Marvin, and I love Uncle Marvin, and you're going to die now. So there had to be this situation. But if you were lying in wait to catch somebody, then there was no manslaughter. But the clear indication here is the ambush is only unlawful if it was to spill innocent blood. It wouldn't have been unlawful for the avenger of blood to set an ambush, to capture the one. And so this is the principle that reveals to us the lack of innocence. The reason that the Lord can say, I'm setting an ambush, is because the declaration is, they're guilty. God, who sees all hearts and knows all men and knows the end from the beginning. Or we could do that Christian thing where we start pulling apart the Bible and say, well, maybe it's not all real and there's inconsistencies and discrepancies. Or we could say, or maybe if we start putting it together properly, we can see that what God is actually telling us is they aren't innocent. They aren't innocent. That's exactly. Now, that's then revealed to us through the nature of what happens next. Since the Lord has instituted this ambush, and the Lord doesn't break his word or change his mind, we can only come to the conclusion that it's not an ambush on innocent people, but on the guilty. In fact, it's the ambush which reveals their guilt. Think about it this way. In chapter 7, the spies suggested that they only took with them 3,000 men of war against how many? 12,000. We all agreed that's an incredibly arrogant thing to do and quite foolish. It revealed and showed how they had not grasped how it was the Lord and not they which had brought down the walls of Jericho. And they clearly come to that place of belief that they were all powerful instead of understanding that they were weak and God was all powerful. Now here in this chapter, Joshua says, it says at the beginning, Joshua took all the men of war. He set up 2 ambushes of 30,000 and 5,000 men. He then takes the remaining of his army, which is estimated to be anywhere between 200,000 and 500,000 men. And the 12,000 men of Ai said, come on guys, we can take them. That's arrogance personified. I mean, that's beyond. That's the little Jack Russell that thinks it's going to take on a pack of Great Danes. It's Scrappy-Doo. Let me at him. Let me at him. It's crazy. Not only that, what we read in verse 11 is that Joshua camped on the other side of a valley. So not only did they have the superior numbers, 20 times their number, they also had the actual physical advantage that they had the higher ground. And in military terms, the higher ground is always the better battle position. Because anybody knows, running uphill isn't fun. Running uphill in armour is probably less fun. Running uphill in armour to somebody who wants to chop you in pieces and make you go back down the hill has got to be even less fun. They've got all the advantage, you've got none whatsoever at all. Everything is on their side. It's the most silly, and as Janet said, it's one of the most stupidest battle plans you could ever kind of think of. And you've got to ask the question, why on earth would they have done it? Well, before we get to that, can you remember what Rahab said about all the people of Canaan? Just turn back to Joshua 2 and let's read verses 9 and 11. 9 to 11, sorry, I want 10 as well. 9, 10 and 11. Joshua 2, 9 and 11.
Said to the man, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard of the Lord, how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed.
She makes it abundantly clear they are not just the Jerichonites, but all the people of Canaan. They're terrified. Their hearts have gone. They're not scared of the Israelites. They're scared of the Lord. They're scared of Jehovah. We now know that Joshua's name has now been spread with that. And he may think, well, the AI thing has kind of maybe tarnished my name in this respect. But they're still scared of the Lord. How did the Jerichonites react to that? Well, let's just have a look at Joshua 6, verse 1. When the children of Israel turned up,
Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in.
they shut the door, they locked them up, and they were not leaving their walls. They didn't have any faith in them, but they didn't have any other faith. And now the day of judgment had come, they'd missed their Rahab opportunity. The spies had already been. And instead of seeking them out in the same way that the king of Nineveh sought out Jonah, and the whole nation repented, they had made their bed. And they didn't actually like their bed, and they didn't trust in their bed, but they still stayed behind it. And they still laid in it, and they still, what would happen? And of course, that's why those walls and the rebuilding of those walls became an anathema to the things of the people of God. They certainly didn't rush out to defeat the Israelites. They had no battle strategy to go and get there. They knew they'd lost. Now, with just 12,000 soldiers, the men of Ai, along with the men of Bethel, it tells us, leave their own stronghold to chase down an army between 10 and 20 times larger than they are. They lose all their natural advantages against a vastly superior army. And there isn't a general in the world, apart from one called Haig, who would do things like that. Arrogance has changed sides. It's now gone to the men of Ai. And they could say, well, look, we took them last time, guys. We killed all 36 of them. Just a few more to go. You have to ask, what could they possibly have been thinking? And the only answer that comes back is they had to be thinking the same way that Achan did. that either they didn't believe in the Lord, they didn't believe that the Lord would fight for Israel, they believed they were far superior as they'd beaten the Israelites before, or what I think is probably the most likely, they started to trust in their own gods. And this was a battle of gods that was going on. But it wasn't until they left the city and sprung the ambush that arrogance, that same idolatry, that same rejection of God which Achan had shown, which cost Achan and his family and his tents their lives, it wasn't until the ambush was sprung, and it wasn't until they left the city that the ambush was to be sprung. Now think about it this way. In other words, God gave them their mercy opportunity too. If they never left their walls, Joshua's battle plan could never be enacted. The 35,000 men couldn't go in the city. But because they saw the 200,000 men running into the wilderness, they believed in the power of their gods over the Lord God. And Rahab declared a testimony of 40 years of age that still had the power to knock the knees together of all the men. We will see over these next few weeks as we look at them, of the Gibeonites, so afraid that they come up with an elaborate plan to make peace with the Israelites. That Adoni-Zedek starts to create a confederate of nations to try and destroy Israel. They're all utterly terrified, and they can't try and come up with every plan that they can, but here's plucky AI. Don't worry, boys, we'll do it. Because they had got an absolute arrogance that they were far superior to God. And it was revealed in their actions. In other words, the punishment was poured out for unbelief. When, just as Achan, all of options of returning from that spiritual void or rejecting the broad way had gone. And their own spiritual arrogance, the I did it my way, was revealed. But it was not until they turned to see the fire of their city and realized that they were now surrounded that they knew that they were wrong. Just turn with me to 2 Peter chapter 3. And let's read verses 3 to 10. It's only when they see the fire that they know that all that they thought was wrong. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 to 10.
This is now the second letter that I am writing to you, beloved. In both of them, did I write that?
2 Peter chapter 3,
Yeah, sorry.
verses 3 to 10.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I was talking to you.
It's all right.
This is now the second letter that I am writing to you, beloved. In both of them, I am stirring up your sincere mind by way of reminder that you should remember the predictions of the holy prophets and the commandments of the Lord and Saviour through your apostles. Knowing this first of all, the scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. For they deliberately overlook the fact that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. But do not overlook this fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some of you count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. And for that exposed, some versions say be burned up.
It's not until the fire that they realise that they were wrong. For all those who have their did it their way attitude, the way is made clear. There's no way to the mercy seat unless you go by the way of the one who was hung upon a tree, removed, and then buried. Amen. Does anybody have any other questions?
If they had the Ten Commandments in the Ark,
Yes?
why can't you take that to the altar like for those?
So why, if they've got 10 commandments in the ark and now 10 commandments? Well, the ark was never permanently meant to be there. So that's the reason it's Shiloh. Shiloh was its place for that time, but when the kingdom came, it would always travel around. The ark never always remained there either as well. Often they took it out into war and places like that. And what was in the ark, Aaron's rod, the pot of manna, the 10 commandments. Later, the Philistines would put the golden boils and the golden mice in there as well. They were all representations of the power of God, and they actually all have a meaning towards Jesus as well. So the reason being is, when we think about typology, it's not accidental. God makes deliberate reasons. The design of the temple, the tabernacle, and all the things that are in it are made so that for the generations to come we have that. But this stands over that. It stands almost like it's there on the valley. And it was there on the blessing side as well, not on the cursing side. It was there on the blessing side that they would speak it. And so, although they were in there, nobody's ever seen them. In fact, nobody did see them again. Because that was never removed. That was not part of what had to be done when they travelled the earth. In fact, the only person that's seen it since then was Harrison Ford. And it came in. There you go. Has anybody else got anything? Or observations as well, anything that jumps out of them? Or deep questions, because this is one of those chapters that could feel a bit disjointed.
Was that why the king of Ai was saved at the end?
It is a common fact, and in fact you'll see it a few times. The kings are the ones that are then kind of punished in a separate way. Regicide is the name of killing kings. You kill them. And I know it's a great name, isn't it? Regicide. When you think about the French Revolution, what started to disturb the monarchs of Europe was that the French people stood up and beheaded their monarch. And, well, although none of them were friends of France, and we'd been to war with them many times, all of a sudden we were all lovey-dovey with the French royal family, because no royal family wants to be the next head on the chopping block. It's the same for Charles I when his head went on. It's a statement when you behead a king, because the divine right of kings, this whole idea that kings are established by God, the idea that leaders, and so every leader of any society tends to come at from some point. Even in the American presidential election, they have to have this kind of declaration that they feel God has called them to this moment, and that he created them for this very absolute. I mean, it's true in almost most elections, probably apart from our own. I don't think that would help anybody in this country if they said, I believe that God has called me here. But other than that, is the case. So the reason he would be last is because of position. His position then also meant he would bear a very different punishment. So King Agag, Samuel chops him into pieces in front of Saul, who tries to spare him. And sometimes they go one way or the other, but they're just treated differently, because if you were in the habit of killing kings, then it doesn't mean that your people aren't going to be in the habit of killing you. So you don't encourage that kind of thing. Which is why he was left. You know, the people take that as a sense. Anything else? It's a good question.
Who were the strangers that were living among them?
So that's the people from Egypt who said, you know what? We're coming with you because we think you've got the better side of this. So there were plenty of people did. Now, one of those is an interesting character, Caleb. Caleb is not Hebrew born. He's a foreigner. You've got the children of Midian that came with Jethro. And some of them, they got a different name, and I can't remember that. They stayed and they helped them through the wilderness areas. So there were quite a lot of different groups that stayed with them. A lot of them were adopted into the tribes then. There wasn't the 13 tribes and the foreigners, but it kind of just meant the people who were Hebrew but not born Hebrew. It was the beginning of the proselyte era, really, which is the case. And it's funny, really, that that's set out because what I think that Joshua is trying to say here is, if you read it in Deuteronomy 27, these tribes are on this side, these tribes are on this side, and Joshua says, well, we haven't abandoned these people. They're not stuck over in the acacia grove. They've come with us into the promise because they followed and believed. Now, there were plenty of people in the camp who didn't. They came with them, but they didn't believe any of it. They didn't cross over.
So Jews have never been a pure brave right from the beginning, then?
If you read that at the beginning of Ezekiel 16, when it talks about Jerusalem, it said, my father was a Hittite, my mother a Midianite, or something like that. I can't remember. Assyrian. No is the answer that kind of comes like that. The Shemitic line that comes from Shem and the way that comes through, they are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what the line is. But although there is no idea of evangelism in the Jewish religion, there's no go out into all the world and make disciples of the nations in their thing. That's why it's Matthew who's writing to the Jewish people who talks about the evangelistic message more, because he's trying to express to them having a family isn't enough. You've got people like the Ethiopian eunuch and like the Queen of Sheba who want to come and know more. You have people like the Greeks who turn up and are interested in this idea of a monotheistic religion. You've got people who dabble with the foot, and then you've got people who do the full-on conversion. And that's why the Pharisees would go to the Gentile groups in the church and say, well, you guys should be doing what the proselytes do. You should be being circumcised. You should be keeping kosher. And that's why we understand that Christianity isn't the proselytizing of Gentiles into a Jewish religion. It's the creation of the bride, with Shiloh becoming Jerusalem. I think that was a good question as well. Yeah, that's it. Any others? They've all been good questions tonight. And good observations. Anybody else? Anything? It did. Shechem not only became a city of refuge, it also became one where they put a golden calf. It was one where Rehoboam was crowned. And then he came up with the great idea of taxing the people even worse than Solomon did, and lost the kingdom, including Shechem, where he was. It became the capital of Jeroboam, where the religion of Jeroboam came out of. And it's funny because if you think about that, and it's exactly what we said, well, it can't be made out of hewn stones. It didn't even need to. Even with what it was, it still then became. He picked the location and the place. Why? Because it was so close to Shiloh. It was so close to what was already. And they took the things of God and corrupted them. Which is the way. Remember, the devil creates nothing. He corrupts things. But God restores them. He doesn't throw them out. And always remember that. Amen. Anybody for anything else? Or forever? The javelin. Well, it's a war thing. It's not an uncommon idea. So it was, if you think Moses carried what did Moses carry? Staff. So when they went into war, Moses had to keep the staff up, and as he kept the staff up, the people were winning. And every time he dropped it, the people started to lose. This shows the difference between Moses' calling as a shepherd and the calling of Joshua as a captain. a spear or a javelin, depending on which translation of the Bible, as he holds it up, it's the same thing now. So it's like the Roman army would do this. They call it a battle standard. When the battle standard, as long as the battle standard is up, everybody that's still alive has to die. It's the same of being in the, not on your own side, on the other side. But it doesn't stop until that comes down. But by Joshua holding it up, there is an element of understanding that there is a physical pain in physically holding something up for a long period of time that is showing that there is a pain to making this decision and to doing this. But and that's why it makes you understand, he didn't let it go until it was completely finished, until every last bit of it was finished. And then, even though everything in him was saying, get your arm down, going, where's my Joshua and Abimelech? Holding my arms. Where's Moses now? That's the case. But it's because his position is different. Very different to the one that Moses had actually prayed for. Moses had prayed for a shepherd. And that's not what Joshua came with. The shepherd comes at you with a javelin. That means your lunch. There we go. The Lord bless you all. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope that you've been blessed by that. Next week we're on chapter 9, the Gibeonites and their deception. I mean, Alan, this Sunday, stole that message, so let's see if you can all remember what he said. Oh, you'll be listening to on YouTube now to see if you can remember it. The Lord bless you.
Yeah.